The night the desert wind changed direction, Jerusalem felt less like a holy city and more like a threshold. I still remember the air, dry enough to sting the back of your throat, carrying sand so fine it found every seam in your cloak. Our caravan had been moving for weeks. We were a string of exhausted bodies and stubborn hopes, following a road that never truly belonged to anyone. Every hill promised a glimpse of the sacred walls. Every valley stole a little more strength. People think pilgrims arrive singing. Most of us arrived silent. That evening, the sky was a deep, bruised blue. The last light bled out behind the distant ridges, and the city's stones held on to warmth like a secret. Around me, men and women lay wherever they could, against walls, beside pack animals, in doorways, on bare ground. Some slept, some stared without blinking, as if their eyes were the only thing still traveling. I was only a novice then, not a knight, not even a brother in full standing. I carried water, I washed wounds, I learned how to lift someone without worsening their pain. I learned how to listen when people could no longer speak. And that night, above the low murmur of the city, I heard a sound that cut through everything. A bell. Not the grand bells that proclaim feast days, not the distant peal you hear from towers on a bright morning. This was smaller, sharper, urgent. The kind of sound meant for hands that must move immediately. A call for help. My feet started before my thoughts caught up. I ran through the dim courtyard near the church of the Holy Sepulchre, past shadows hunched over bundles, past the tired faces of strangers who no longer looked like strangers, because hunger and fear make everyone part of the same family. The bell rang again, and with each ring I felt my pulse answer it, as if my body recognized the command before my mind did. The hospital was close, our humble refuge of stone and linen, built to receive the broken after the road had done its worst. In those days, it was not a fortress. It was not an institution with banners and wealth and fame. It was simply a place where suffering was allowed to enter without being questioned. I reached the doorway and pulled back a hanging cloth. The air inside was heavy with the familiar smells: hot water, sweat, herbs crushed into paste, wax from candles, and the sour note of fever. A few brothers moved quietly between beds, their steps practiced, their voices low. In that half-light, even mercy had to be efficient. Near the entrance, a man had collapsed. He was not a knight, no mail shirt, no proud belt, no weapon at his side. Just a traveler, perhaps a merchant, his clothes stained with dust and something darker. His hands still wrapped around a small cloth bag, like it contained his final reason to stay alive. His chest rose in shallow, uneven pulls. His eyes searched for a face that might be kind. I knelt beside him and slid my arm behind his shoulders, careful not to jolt him. His skin was hot, too hot. His lips were cracked, the edges pale. He tried to speak. At first, nothing came out but breath. Then, in a voice that sounded as if it had to scrape its way up from deep inside him, he whispered, "There were men on the road." His eyes shifted toward the doorway, toward the darkness beyond the courtyard, toward all the paths that lead into Jerusalem like veins. He swallowed hard, and his fingers tightened around the bag. Watching, following. I glanced toward the entrance, and for a heartbeat I expected to see someone there. But the courtyard remained a patchwork of shadow and dim torchlight. No movement, no sound except the bell fading and the restless city beyond the walls. Then I felt a presence behind me, steady as stone. Gerard. He was the man who ran our house, though "ran" was too small a word for what he did. He held the place together with discipline, with prayer, and with a strange calm that never seemed shaken by the worst of what arrived at our door. He had the eyes of someone who had seen too much and decided not to look away anymore. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. He simply said, "Bring him in." I nodded and shifted the man's weight carefully. Gerard stepped closer, watching the traveler's face, reading it like a document. The traveler's breath hitched. I guided him beyond the threshold, toward the interior beds, and as I adjusted the man's sleeve to check his pulse, I saw it. On his wrist, beneath the grime and dried blood, was a bruise, dark and uneven. Not the bruise of a fall, not the swelling of an impact. It was a mark left by pressure, like a cord had bitten into his skin. A ring of pain, tightened and released. My throat dried. I looked at Gerard. He saw it too. He didn't flinch. He didn't curse. He simply stared at the mark for a long moment, as if that bruised skin was a message. Then he spoke softly, not to me, not to the merchant, but almost to the air itself. Jerusalem needs a hospital, but sooner or later it will need a living fence. The words settled inside me like a stone dropped into water. I felt the ripple of them spreading outward, touching everything I thought I understood about why we were here. Because until that moment, my world was simple. People arrived broken, we tried to mend them. If they died, we prayed. If they lived, we thanked God and cleaned the bed for the next one. Our work was hard, but it had a clear shape. Now Gerard had given it a second shape, one I had never allowed myself to imagine. A hospital could treat the wounds of the road, but it could not change the road. And the road was becoming a hungry thing. Jerusalem had changed hands. The Holy Land was no longer simply a place of devotion. It was a place of borders, of tension, of constant movement. Pilgrims came in waves, traders came with goods and gossip, and with every new arrival, the danger grew. A crowded road invites predators. A holy destination attracts both faith and opportunity, and the weak, always the weak, paid first. I followed Gerard deeper into the ward. The merchant's eyes rolled back, his grip loosening. Another brother came with water and a cloth, and I shifted into the familiar rhythm. Lift, support, lay down, steady the head, wet the lips, wait for breath to settle. Small actions, precise actions, actions that could mean the difference between a man returning to the sunlight or disappearing before dawn. But my mind kept returning to Gerard's words. A living fence. I had seen fences. In Amalfi, where my family was from, fences marked property and kept animals from straying. In the countryside, fences were practical, quiet things. They did not pray, they did not bleed, they did not have names. A living fence meant people. It meant brothers like us who had taken vows, who rose before dawn to pray, who served the sick without asking where they were born or which prayers they whispered. It meant hands that held bandages might also hold a shield. It meant that devotion might have to stand in the road itself and say, "Not here, not today." That night, after the merchant slept or drifted into something that looked like sleep, I stepped outside into the courtyard again. The wind had cooled. Somewhere in the city, a dog barked once and fell silent. Torches hissed softly. I looked toward the darkness beyond the walls, toward the invisible roads, and for the first time I felt that the Holy Land was not only a destination, it was a responsibility. In the distance, Jerusalem's stones rose like a promise, but beneath that promise was an unspoken question. How long could the promise hold? I stood there until my hands stopped trembling. I tried to pray, but the words felt too neat, too clean. So instead, I listened. I listened to the city breathing. I listened to the footsteps of brothers moving inside, the quiet clink of a bowl, the soft scrape of sandals on stone. And somewhere in that listening, something else happened, something I still cannot explain in ordinary language. It felt like a name being called. Not aloud, not by any voice I could point to, more like a pull in the chest, the way the sea pulls at a boat even when the water looks calm. I turned my head as if someone had spoken behind me, but there was empty air and torchlight. Still, the feeling remained, a sense that I had arrived at the edge of a life I did not yet understand. I was young enough to be afraid of what I might become. I was old enough to know I could not step back. Inside the hospital, the bell was...
My name is Matteo.
I was born into the world of ledgers and cargo holds, the kind of life where you learn the weight of a sack of grain before you learn the weight of a prayer. My father was a merchant from Amalfi. He trusted balance scales, ship manifests, and the clean certainty of a signed agreement. My mother trusted relics, saints, and the invisible architecture of faith. And me, I grew up between them, one foot on the dock and the other in the chapel. When I first arrived in Jerusalem, I thought I was coming to the end of a journey. I didn't realize I was stepping into the beginning of a vow. Our hospital, what people later would call the Hospital of St. John, did not begin as an army or even as a grand institution. It began the way most true things begin, quietly, out of necessity. Decades before the Crusaders captured Jerusalem, merchants from Amalfi sought permission to establish a place near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, a shelter for pilgrims, a refuge for the poor, a house where a traveler could collapse without being abandoned. If you ask me what it looked like in those early days, I won't describe banners or ceremony. I'll describe the sound of water boiling in a pot. I'll describe the rough linen that scratched your hands as you tore it into strips. I'll describe the way a room can feel both crowded and lonely when too many people are suffering at once. Jerusalem was never gentle with those who came to it. Even before the great armies arrived, the city was already a magnet. Pilgrims came from Western Europe with blistered feet and sunburnt skin, believing the road itself could cleanse them. Many reached the gates exhausted, sick, or half-starved. Some arrived carrying diseases they didn't understand, carried in their blood, in their lungs, in the water they drank on the way. And in our hospital, we learned to treat what we could treat, and to sit beside what we could not cure. Gerard was the one who taught me how to do that without turning my heart to stone. He didn't teach like a scholar. He taught like a man who had been forced by reality to become wise. Wash your hands, he'd tell me, not as a ritual, but as a rule. He didn't know about microbes, no one did, but he had seen enough to understand patterns. Touch the sick, then touch the healthy, and soon you have twice the suffering. Leave waste too close to water, and the ward fills with fever. Let flies gather and wounds fester. He was strict about simple things. Boil water when you can. Clean the bowls. Change the linens. Keep the air moving. If you cannot stop death, at least do not invite it. And he taught something else, something harder. Do not ask who they are, he said. Ask what they need. There were men and women in our ward who were not Christian. They were people whose prayers sounded foreign to my ear. There were faces marked with different customs, different diets, different fears. Yet pain flattened those differences. A mother crying for her child sounds the same in any language. A man burning with fever looks at you with the same pleading eyes whether he wears a cross or not. For many years, that was our entire purpose, to be a place where suffering could come without permission. Then the first crusade arrived and the world changed shape. In the year 1099, say it slowly, and you can still feel how far back it sits in time, Jerusalem fell to the Crusader armies. Histories describe the capture with grand words and bitter arguments, with triumph and horror tangled together. I won't pretend I can tell that story from above, like a judge or a poet. I was inside the hospital. I saw what came after. What came after was a flood. Wounded men, broken limbs, infection, thirst, shock. People who had survived violence only to collapse at the threshold of the city they believed would redeem them. We ran out of beds, then we ran out of linens, then we ran out of quiet. Some days the ward felt less like a building and more like a battlefield of breath, each body fighting its private war against fever and exhaustion. And yet, even in that chaos, the hospital grew. Because after the Crusaders took Jerusalem, the new Crusader states needed more than walls and swords. They needed pilgrims to feed the city. They needed traders to feed the city. They needed the West to keep sending ships, money, men, and supplies. They needed the road to Jerusalem to remain open, because without the road, the kingdom would suffocate. That was the cruel truth. Victory did not make the road safer. It made it busier. And a busy road attracts danger. Pilgrims began to arrive telling the same stories over and over. Groups attacked in narrow passes, travelers robbed of water, wagons stripped, people left behind when they could no longer walk. Some crawled into the city on hands and knees, eyes glazed from dehydration, lips cracked like dry earth. We took them in, of course, But every time we cleaned another wound, I felt the same thought rising like bile. We are treating the symptom, not the source. One night, Gerard took me to the roof. From there, Jerusalem looked almost peaceful, stones glowing faintly under the moon, narrow streets winding like dark threads. But beyond the walls, the land fell away into emptiness, into roads I couldn't see, and the unseen men who waited on them. Gerard asked me a question I still hear in my mind. "Gerard," he said, "can a prayer become a wall?" I didn't know how to answer. I was young enough to believe prayer could do anything, but old enough to recognize the sharp edge of reality. He did impress me. He simply looked out towards the darkness and said, "We were founded to heal those who arrive, but if the road remains a wound, the hospital will become a bucket catching despair, and sooner or later, someone will decide to stand on the road itself." That was the first time I understood that our calling might widen, not change, widen. Years later, the hospital received formal recognition from the Pope. It happened in the year 1113. Again, say it like a date you could carve into stone. That recognition mattered. It meant we were no longer merely a local shelter. We became an order under a rule, protected and empowered, able to hold property, receive donations, build a network across Europe. And those donations came from France, England, the Italian cities, the German lands, coins, lands, rents, and the promise of more. In some places, people donated out of genuine piety. In others, they donated for spiritual benefit, a hope that supporting a holy hospital might lighten the burden of sin. Whatever the reason, the effect was the same. Our hospital gained strength. With strength came structure. With structure came responsibility. And with responsibility came men whose backgrounds were different. Not all who joined us were gentle hands suited only for bowls and bandages. Some were born into the knightly class. Some knew horses. Some knew armor. Some spent their lives learning to guard, to patrol, to hold ground. They entered our brotherhood and brought that knowledge with them, like a blade kept carefully ensheathed. At first, it was informal. A few brothers began escorting pilgrims along certain routes, not as a full military force, not as a proclamation, simply as presence. A handful of disciplined men riding alongside the weak so the weak could reach Jerusalem alive. But presence changes things. Once you place men on a road, you invite resistance. Once you escort pilgrims, you become responsible for them. Once you accept responsibility, you must organize it. And once you organize it, the world starts calling you something new. Some people would later say they were only a hospital. Others would insist they were warriors of God. From inside the order, it didn't feel like a sudden transformation. It felt like a slow, reluctant adaptation, like a tree leaning with the wind, because refusing would mean snapping. We still prayed, we still served the poor and the sick, we still treated whoever arrived regardless of faith. But the hospital was no longer only a building. It was becoming a promise that extended beyond its walls, outward, towards the road. And I began to feel the weight of that promise. I remember watching one of those brothers, Ugas, set a plain shield against the wall in the courtyard. It was just a shield. Wood, iron rim, scuffed surface. Nothing poetic about it. Yet seeing it there, near the place where we washed wounds, felt like a new chapter opening. Ugas looked at me and said, "We keep the road. You keep the bed." I answered, "The road and the bed need each other." He smiled, but his eyes did not. His eyes were already living on the border. That night, I lay awake listening to the city, and I realized what we were becoming. We had started as a refuge for exhausted pilgrims, built by merchants who wanted a safe place near the heart of Christian devotion. We had become a network of care, fed by the wealth and faith of Europe. And now, in a land where safety was never guaranteed, we were being shaped into something harder. Not a replacement for prayer, a companion to it. Because in Jerusalem, mercy without endurance is fragile, and endurance without mercy becomes something else entirely. If our order was to survive, and if the pilgrims were to survive with us, then the vow could not remain only inside the hospital. It would have to walk out into the dust. It would have to stand where the danger lived. And whether I was ready or not, whether I understood it fully or not, I knew I was already part of that story.
People ask the same question whenever they hear our story. How does a hospital become a fighting order? They imagine there must have been a single moment, some decree, some dramatic turning point, a day when we set aside bowls and bandages and suddenly reached for swords. But that's not how it happened. Not from where I stood. From the inside, it felt slower, like a tide you don't notice until your ankles are already wet. In those early years after the Crusaders took Jerusalem, the city changed its rhythm. More pilgrims arrived, more traders arrived, more people tried to build a new life in a land that was still raw with conflict. And the roads became the real battlefield, even when no great armies were in sight. Every week brought new stories to our doors. A group that had been followed for 2 days and attacked at the worst possible moment, when their water was low and the sun was high. A family stripped of everything but their clothes. A young man who staggered into Jerusalem with hands shaking, not from hunger alone, but from the shock of realizing he could die within sight of the place he had crossed continents to reach. We received them all. We washed their wounds. We boiled water. We fed them what we could. But the pattern was impossible to ignore. If the roads remained dangerous, our hospital would never be enough. You can treat the injuries of the road, but you cannot treat the road itself, unless you step onto it. That was the pressure that pushed our brotherhood into something new. At first, it wasn't announced. No trumpet call, no grand banner raised above the courtyard. It started with small decisions made by men who had seen too much suffering to remain still. Some of our brothers came from noble families. They knew horses, they knew armor, they had trained since childhood for a life of protection and violence, even if they had laid that life down when they entered the hospital. Those men began to look at the pilgrim routes the way a shepherd looks at a wolf trail. And one day, quietly, they began escorting pilgrims. Just a few riders at first, a presence, a warning to anyone watching from the hills that these travelers were not alone. When those early escorts returned, they didn't speak loudly about what they had done. They didn't boast. Most of them went straight to the chapel, knelt, and stayed there longer than usual. I remember watching them and realizing something that unsettled me. They were not proud of what they had to do. They were relieved they had been able to do it at all. Because the road didn't care about our vows, and the people on the road, those who waited in the dark, didn't care either. If we wanted to keep our promise to the weak, we had to find a way to be present where the weak were most exposed. That's how the hospital began to grow teeth. We still lived by prayer. We still kept the hours. We still served the sick and the poor. But now, behind the storerooms and near the stables, there were racks where male shirts hung. There were shields resting against walls. There were saddles ready, not for ceremony, but for the long, dusty work of patrol. A strange kind of double life emerged, one foot in the chapel, the other in the frontier dust. And we needed symbols, not because we wanted spectacle, but because discipline requires identity. Men who operate far from the city, far from comfort, need something to remind them who they are when fear rises. Our mantle was black, black like renunciation, black like night prayer, black like the humility of those who do not claim glory. And on that black, we wore the white cross, white like the linen we wrapped around wounds, white like the idea that even in the darkest places there is a light you refuse to abandon. Later, as time moved on, some of our brothers wore red surcoats in the field, practical, visible, and charged with meaning. But in my mind, the true colors of what we were becoming remained black and white, discipline and mercy, endurance and compassion. What changed for me wasn't the sight of armor. It was the fear that armor might harden the heart. I was still a healer at my core. I had joined to carry water and bind wounds, not to stand behind shields. When I watched those brothers return from patrol, dust on their boots, eyes tired, I wondered what it did to a man to live with two kinds of duty: the duty to preserve life and the duty to confront those who threaten it. One evening in the courtyard, I saw Hughes lean a shield against a wall near the infirmary. It was plain, almost ugly in its simplicity, wood, iron rim, scratches from use. He caught me looking at it and said, "We keep the road, you keep the bed." I answered without thinking, "The road and the bed need each other." He gave a brief smile, but his eyes remained serious. Those eyes belonged to someone who had seen the border close, seen how quickly a quiet path can become a trap. That night, after the lamps were lowered, I heard movement outside, horses shifting, a saddle creaking, low voices, another escort leaving under moonlight. I wanted to follow, but I stayed where I was, hands smelling faintly of herbs and boiled water, watching the shadows lengthen across the courtyard stones. I realized then that our brotherhood was becoming a bridge between the world of suffering and the world of danger, and bridges get tested. Not long after, I witnessed something that stayed with me. A group of those returning riders went directly into the chapel, still wearing dust and sweat, and they knelt without removing their gear. Their belts creaked, mail clinked softly, but the posture was the same as any prayer, heads bowed, hands still, breath steady. In that moment, I understood the transformation wasn't about replacing faith with force. It was about refusing to let faith become helpless. Still, I couldn't shake the worry. If you ask a man to carry a shield long enough, will he start seeing everyone as a threat? If you give him power, will he forget tenderness? If we became too much like soldiers, would we lose what made us different? That question haunted me, and it followed me into sleep. One night, I dreamed of a man standing at the gate of the hospital. He was old, older than any man I knew, clothed in rough cloth like a pilgrim who had walked too far to care about appearances. His face was calm, but his eyes were like deep water. He carried a simple staff. There was no glow around him, no miracle in the air, nothing theatrical, yet the dream felt heavier than dreams usually do. He stepped close and raised his hand, and without speaking, he touched my chest, right where the cross would sit. It wasn't painful exactly. It was warm, like a coal held near skin, just enough to leave a mark in memory. His finger pressed gently, then lifted away. I woke up with my heart racing. My hand went instinctively to my chest, as if I could still feel the touch. The air was cold, the night outside was silent, but I couldn't dismiss it as nothing. It felt like a message delivered without words. I didn't tell anyone, not then. In a world like ours, people collect stories and turn them into banners, and I didn't want my private fear and hope to become someone else's propaganda. But the dream changed something in me. It didn't make me crave battle. It didn't make me eager for armor. What it did was sharpen a truth I had been avoiding. My work was no longer confined to the walls of the infirmary. Even if I never rode out as a knight, I would be part of an order that did, and I would have to find a way to remain myself inside that reality. Over time, the escorts became patrols. Patrols became units. Units needed rules. Rules needed leaders. The hospital, once simply a refuge, became a structured body with roles, ranks, and obligations, a living machine of service. And I began to understand the paradox at its heart. We were men who vowed humility, yet we built power. We were men who vowed to care for the weak, yet we learned to confront danger. We were men of prayer, yet we accepted that prayer alone might not keep a pilgrim alive on a lonely road. It was not a comfortable transformation. It never should be. If it ever feels comfortable to merge faith with force, something has gone wrong. But in those days, in that land, comfort was not a luxury we possessed. So we carried both burdens. Some nights I stood at the edge of the courtyard listening for hoofbeats returning. Other nights I worked in the infirmary until my hands trembled from exhaustion. And through it all, the white cross on black cloth remained a reminder to me. The symbol was not a permission to become hardened. It was a warning not to. Because a brother who forgets mercy becomes only another armed man in a land already full of them. And a hospital that forgets the road becomes a house waiting to be overwhelmed. So we learned to live in the tension. We learned to pray with dust still on our boots. We learned to hold a wounded traveler in 1 hour and to plan an escort in the next. And I learned, slowly, painfully, that this was the shape of our calling now. Not a clean, simple life, but a life stretched between the bed.
Belvoir was the first place where I truly understood what it meant to turn a vow into stone. I reached it after the world had already begun to tighten around us, after the roads became more dangerous, after the borderlands stopped feeling like distant edges and started feeling like the front door.
From far away, the fortress didn't look like a building so much as a decision, a hard shape set on a cliff, refusing to be ignored. They called it Belvoir, beautiful view. The name sounded gentle, almost like a pilgrim's blessing. But when you stood there, with the wind cutting across the ridge and the Jordan Valley opening beneath you, the beauty carried a different message. Beauty in that place meant command. It meant you could see the road before the road could reach you. The locals had their own name for it, something like Star of the Wind. And once you spent a day on that height, you understood why. The wind didn't simply pass through, it seemed to live there, always moving, always testing every latch, every cloak, every nerve. When our order began to build Belvoir, it wasn't out of vanity, it was out of necessity. The kingdom of Jerusalem was no longer advancing with confidence. The tide had begun to shift. People were suddenly looking at the map not as a dream, but as a set of wounds that needed to be stitched closed. Belvoir was placed where it could do the most important job on a frontier, delay what could not yet be stopped. One of the key routes into the kingdom ran south of the Sea of Galilee, Lake Tiberias as we called it, then down toward the heartlands. Whoever held the heights above that route could watch movement, disrupt raids, warn nearby towns, and hold a line long enough for others to prepare. Standing on the cliff edge, I could see the logic laid out below like a diagram. A valley floor where a marching force would have to funnel through. Distant ridgelines where banners could appear one morning and be gone by noon. Even farther, like a mirror in the haze, the silhouette of another fortress watching back. Proof that on this frontier, eyes were weapons too. But Belvoir was more than position. It was an announcement. From the moment I first walked its outer perimeter, I felt as if I was inside a statement written in stone. We are here, we intend to remain, and we can afford to build for permanence. What struck me most was the shape of it. Belvoir wasn't a simple ring of walls like older strongholds. It was layered, walls within walls, strength behind strength. If one line failed, another waited. The design felt almost prophetic, as if the builders had decided not to gamble on a single defense, but to force any enemy to face multiple barriers, each one harder than the last. And then there were the colors. The lower courses were built from dark basalt, so dark it looked nearly black in certain light. Above it, lighter limestone rose in clean faces and sharper edges. Some said the builders simply used what was near. Others murmured that it was intentional, black and white, like our own identity, turned into architecture. I can't swear to the truth of that. I only know what it did to the eye. From a distance, Belvoir looked like a chessboard carved into the cliff, an unmistakable black and white fortress daring the horizon to move. We took pilgrims there sometimes, those who still traveled despite the rising danger, and I would watch their faces change as they stepped through the gate. Many of them had donated coins back in Europe, small offerings given in churches after sermons that promised holy purpose. Here, they could see what their offerings became, not poetry, not abstraction, stone, towers, wells, storerooms, a place meant to hold. And when the pilgrims looked at Belvoir, they didn't just see a castle, they saw a promise that their journey mattered enough to protect. In those days, our order lived on more than discipline. We lived on belief. Belief carried on ships, in coins, and letters stamped with seals, in whispers passed from one monastery to another across the sea. A fortress like Belvoir didn't just slow an enemy, it strengthened the story that kept the West sending help. But stories can't stop what's coming. They can only buy time. And time is exactly what Belvoir was built to purchase. By the late 12th century, a name traveled through every outpost and every court: Salah ad-Din, Saladin. Some spoke it with fear, others with reluctant respect. The man was not just a commander, he was a unifier. He gathered forces that had once been fragmented, and he aimed them at the heart of the Crusader world. His goal was not simply land, it was meaning, Jerusalem. When word reached us that his armies were moving, you could feel the change before you saw the banners. Traders spoke more quietly. Patrols returned with sharper eyes. Commanders stopped arguing over pride and started counting provisions. Then came the disaster at Hattin, one of those events that splits history into a before and an after. The Crusader field army was broken, and after that, the fall of Jerusalem was no longer unthinkable. It was only a matter of when. Belvoir became an island of stone in a sea of shifting ground. The siege did not arrive like a single thunderclap. It gathered,
Scouts appeared, distant encampments formed. Then the ring tightened until the fortress was surrounded, cut from the roads, cut from easy resupply, cut from the comforting idea that someone would arrive in time. Inside, we adjusted to a new rhythm, the rhythm of waiting under pressure. We checked the cisterns, we rationed food, we inspected weapons, yes, but also ropes, pulleys, water jars, and medical supplies. A siege does not only test walls, it tests bodies, it tests minds, it tests whether a community can remain a community when the horizon is closed. From the outside, many imagine a siege as constant noise and constant assault. The truth is more exhausting. It is long stretches of tension broken by sudden bursts of danger. It is sleeplessness. It is listening for a sound that means the enemy is closer than before. Belvoir's defenses made direct assault costly. The cliff itself was a defense, turning one side into a sheer refusal. On the other approaches, deep trenches and layered walls forced any attacker to slow down. And behind those walls, we had lines of retreat built into the architecture, places to pull back without collapsing into panic, places to regroup when the outer line could not be held. I remember walking those inner corridors late at night, my torch throwing moving light across the stone. I would place my hand against the wall and feel its cold steadiness. The basalt below held the chill of the earth. The limestone above smelled faintly of dust and sun. And I would ask myself a question I didn't want to speak aloud. If our symbol had become a fortress, what happened when the fortress fell? Because that was the truth we all carried. No wall is eternal. Belvoir held on, far longer than many expected. It delayed Saladin's momentum, forced him to invest time and attention here instead of elsewhere. In a war measured not only in victories but in seasons, that delay mattered. But while Belvoir held, the world beyond it changed. After Hattin, other strongholds fell. Supply lines broke, towns surrendered. The political and military landscape collapsed faster than news could travel. A fortress can stand proud, but a fortress cannot replace an entire kingdom. Eventually, the garrison understood the cruel arithmetic. Even if Belvoir could endure another month, another season, another year, what would be left to endure for? There comes a moment when continuing to resist does not protect the cause, it only increases the suffering of those inside. And our order, whatever else it had become, still began as a hospital. We knew how to measure human limits. We knew when bravery stopped being bravery and waste. So Belvoir surrendered, not in panic, not in disgrace, but in the hard clarity of survival. The day we left, the wind was fierce. It snapped at cloaks, filled eyes with grit, tugged at every strap and buckle. I walked through the gate slowly, turning back again and again as if my stare could memorize the stones and carry them with me. From outside, the fortress looked even more striking, black and white, like a scar across the cliff. The sunlight caught the pale stone and made it glow. The dark basalt absorbed the light and held it like ink. And for a moment, I hated the beauty of it, because the beauty made the loss sharper. And yet, as we moved away, something strange happened in me. Under all the grief, under all the bitterness, I felt a steadier thought rising. Belvoir was not the end. It was proof. Proof that our order could build, could organize, could hold a frontier with discipline. Proof that the work of the hospital, care, endurance, responsibility, could be translated into a fortress without losing its soul. Not perfectly, not without danger to the spirit, but with intention. As the path descended from the heights, the wind carried a sound through the stones. Just a thin, whistling echo. For an instant, it reminded me of a bell, that urgent ring in Jerusalem years earlier, the call that had first taught me that mercy cannot always wait safely behind walls. And I understood what the wind was saying in its own language. The stage had changed, the struggle had not. If the Holy Land could not be held in the way we once imagined, then our order would have to learn a harder lesson, how to remain itself even when the ground beneath it shifted. I didn't know where we would go next. I didn't know what the future would demand. But as Belvoir disappeared behind the ridgeline, I carried one certainty with me as solid as any stone we had laid. We had built a fortress on a cliff to hold back a tide. Now we would have to learn how to live when the tide finally came through. When I left Belvoir, I left with empty hands and a heart that felt heavier than any pack I'd ever carried. A fortress teaches you a cruel lesson. Stone can hold the wind, but it can't hold the world. Belvoir had stood proud on its cliff, black and white against the sky, a promise carved into rock. And yet the promise had been forced to bend.
When we finally stepped away from its gates, the air tasted like dust and resignation. I remember thinking, not in anger but in disbelief, how can a place built to endure feel so temporary? The road away from the frontier was filled with people who looked like the last pages of a book being torn out. Refugees, scattered pilgrims, messengers with hollow eyes, men carrying children who no longer cried because they had no strength left. Everyone moved as if the ground behind them might collapse. No one spoke of Jerusalem as a city anymore. They spoke of it like a lamp that had gone out. And in the middle of that drifting world, there was one name that began to surface again and again: Acre. At first, it sounded like a rumor, a port, a refuge, a place where the sea could still carry you back to the west if everything else failed. But the closer I came, the more I understood. Acre wasn't simply a city, it was a hinge. If the Holy Land had a door left open to Europe, it was there. I reached Acre in the early light of morning, when the air over the water still looked silver and the gulls seemed to hover without effort. The first thing I noticed was not the walls, though they were impressive, heavy with Crusader stonework and guarded with watchful discipline. The first thing I noticed was a sound. Acre never truly fell silent. Even at dawn, the harbor was already awake. Rigging creaked, ropes snapped against masts, dock workers shouted, merchants argued, and the sea itself struck the quays with a steady impatience. The scent was different too: salt, tar, wet timber, and spices that drifted from market awnings like invisible banners. Jerusalem smelled of stone and incense. Acre smelled of trade and survival. I stood for a moment at the edge of the quay and watched ships bob against their moorings. Some carried grain, some carried cloth, some carried weapons. Most carried something more valuable than all of those: connection. A line stretched across the Mediterranean back to Europe, back to the donors, the monasteries, the noble courts, the merchants with full purses and complicated consciences. Without that line, everything we were trying to build would suffocate. That was why Acre mattered. After the Third Crusade reclaimed the city, this was in the year 1191, Jerusalem itself remained out of reach. The Holy City stayed beyond our grasp, no matter how many prayers rose from our chapels, or how many oaths were sworn in the West. So Acre became the new center of Crusader life in the region. It became the capital in practice, even if not in the heart. For roughly a century, it was the place where pilgrims arrived, where troops disembarked, where supplies poured in, and where orders like ours anchored themselves to keep the mission alive. Acre was a city of gates and quarters, and each quarter told you who held power there. The Italians, Genoese, Pisans, Venetians, had their own districts with warehouses, counting rooms, guarded streets, and flags that fluttered like declarations. Each banner was a claim. Each warehouse was a fortress in miniature. The city was a mosaic of alliances that could shift with the price of wheat or the mood of a prince. And then there were the military orders. The Templars had their own great complex. You could feel their presence in the way the crowd moved when their patrols passed. Disciplined men in mail, white mantles marked with red crosses, walking as if the street belonged to them by right. They were not loud, but they were never invisible. We, the Hospitallers, were close by, near enough to the sea that we could hear the harbor at night, near enough that if Acre ever faced a siege again, the first shock would reach our walls quickly. Our compound was not just a residence, it was a machine designed to keep breathing when the rest of the world tightened. Chapel, kitchens, storehouses, infirmaries, stables, every part built for function, every part held together by discipline. In Acre, I saw more clearly than ever that a holy war, whatever people wanted to call it, survived on very ordinary things: bread, water, rope, timber, clean linen, ship schedules, letters sealed with wax, coin that could purchase grain before grain became scarce. A creed can inspire men to march, but a harbor is what keeps them alive. On my first day, I walked through the market streets just to understand the city's pulse. It was like stepping into a living storm. Children darting between carts, animals snorting, women bargaining for fish, foreign tongues mixing into a single constant hum. There were smells I'd never known in Amalfi: pepper, cinnamon, incense from the east, and the sharp tang of dyed cloth drying in the sun. You could almost forget the threat beyond the borders. Almost. But then you'd hear a rumor. A caravan attacked on a road. A fortress surrendered inland. a message from the frontier written with more fear than ink. Acre was not safe. It was simply necessary. For the orders, necessity turned into strategy. The sea brought money and supplies, yes, but it also brought scrutiny. Every donation from Europe carried an unspoken question. Are you still worthy of this? Are you still fighting for what we believe you fight for? Are you still holding the line? In the West, people loved the idea of the Holy Land. They loved the idea of brave knights and sacred destinations. But they didn't have to watch the sick die in the heat. They didn't have to count how many barrels of grain remained. They didn't have to look at a map and realize the frontier had moved closer again. So Acre became not just a military staging point, but a stage in a different sense. A place where the story of endurance had to be performed convincingly enough to keep the ships coming. I remember a phrase one of our senior brothers said as we stood on a terrace overlooking the harbor. Jerusalem is the heart, he told me. Acre is the lungs. At the time, I thought it was only poetry, but later I understood the truth behind it. Without Acre, the heart would choke. That evening, I went to the edge of our quarter and watched the harbor as the sun dropped behind the line of mass. The water turned bronze, then black. Lanterns began to appear like fireflies trapped in glass. The city lights flickered on in windows and doorways, and the flags, our flags, the Italian flags, the royal standards, moved in the sea wind as if the city itself was breathing. And I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not relief, a kind of sober fear. Because Acre felt alive in a way Jerusalem never had. Jerusalem was sacred stone, a city that demanded reverence. Acre was a living mouth, always hungry, hungry for supplies, hungry for people, hungry for money, hungry for the next ship. It was loud, crowded, brilliant, and vulnerable. If Acre fell, it wouldn't just be a military loss, it would be a severed artery. That night, I found my way to our small chapel within the compound. The chant was low, steady, familiar, the sound of a rule that doesn't change even when the world does. I kneeled and tried to order my thoughts the way Gerard once taught me. One breath, one prayer, one duty at a time. But as I bowed my head, I realized what had shifted since Belvoir. Back then, we built stone to delay an enemy. Here in Acre, we built systems to delay collapse. Our walls mattered, yes. Our discipline mattered more. Our reputation mattered in ways that were both holy and painfully human. We were no longer just tending the broken who arrived at a door. We were tending an entire kingdom's last lifeline. When I rose from prayer, I stepped outside again into the night air. The harbor noise carried through the streets like a distant tide. Somewhere a bell rang, not the urgent bell of the infirmary, but the practical bell of ships and watchmen, a city keeping time with itself. I stood there listening and understood something with a clarity that left no room for comfort. If Jerusalem had been the dream, Acre was the price of continuing to dream. And if our order was going to survive what was coming, if we were going to protect pilgrims, treat the sick, and hold a frontier that seemed to shrink every season, then Acre would have to become more than a refuge. It would have to become an anchor. A place where our vow could still touch the world, even as the world tried to pull it apart.
If Belvoir taught me what it meant to turn a vow into stone, Acre taught me what it meant to turn a vow into a system. From the outside, our headquarters in Acre looked like another Crusader stronghold. Thick walls, vaulted halls, guarded doors, banners catching the sea wind. But when I stepped inside and lived there day after day, I realized it wasn't built merely to impress. It was built to function. It was built to keep moving even when fear tried to freeze the city in place. Acre was crowded, loud, and restless, like a ship's deck in a rising storm. And our compound had to be the opposite, steady, disciplined, predictable. Not because we were cold men, but because chaos outside demanded order within. I remember my first walk through the inner passages. The stone was cool even in summer. Torchlight and daylight took turns painting the walls, depending on the hour. Every corridor seemed to lead to another task. Stores for grain and oil, stables for horses, rooms for meetings, and always, the chapel and the infirmary, like two lungs breathing in rhythm. People like to speak of military orders as if they live on heroics, but in Acre, I learned that an order lives on routine. A hospital that serves a city cannot survive on inspiration alone. It survives on inventories, on clean water,
on linen that gets washed and folded again and again until it thins, on rules that tell you what to do when you're tired, and what to do when you're afraid, and what to do when the day is so ordinary you forget it matters. The heart of that routine was the refectory, our great dining hall. It was vast, vaulted, and echoing, the kind of room that makes a man feel small even when he walks with confidence. Long tables stretched beneath the arches, and when the brothers gathered, the sound of wood and bowls and footsteps felt like the pulse of a single body. We ate together because we were meant to live together, and while we ate, we listened. Prayers, scripture, announcements, messages from the harbor, reports from the roads. Some days, the news was simple. A shipment of flour arrived, a roof needed repair, a brother fell ill. Other days, the news carried the weight of the frontier. Outposts threatened, routes unsafe, rumors of new movements inland. But even then, the rules did not change. We sat, we listened, we ate, we cleaned, we went back to work. That kind of discipline does something to a man. It steadies you. It also reminds you that your life does not belong entirely to your own moods. In Acre, I began to understand why communal life mattered so much to us. Alone, fear grows teeth. In a brotherhood, fear can be shared, measured, and kept from becoming madness. And still, outside our walls, Acre roared. This city was not like Jerusalem. Jerusalem was stone and silence and sacred longing. Acre was salt and commerce and noise, a place where east met west in 1,000 transactions a day. In the markets, you could hear Italian merchants shouting prices beneath awnings. You could smell spices that seemed too bright for a world this hard. Pepper, cinnamon, incense. You could see silks from the east hanging beside coarse European wool. You could watch children dart between carts while soldiers stepped carefully to avoid them. And in every alley, every plaza, every corner, the city reminded you of one truth. Acre belonged to many hands at once. There were quarters held by Italian cities. There were royal officials. There were local traders who knew every rumor before it reached the walls. And then there were the great orders, each with its own compound, its own stores, its own pride. The Templars were close, too close to forget, even when we tried. You could see them moving through the street sometimes. White mantles, red crosses, measured steps. They carried themselves like men who had been told since youth that the world was watching them. And maybe it was. In the imagination of Europe, the Templars were the shining sword arm of the Crusades. They had a legend that traveled faster than ships. We had a different kind of reputation. People called us healers, caretakers, a hospital. As if that were something smaller. There were days that reputation helped us. It opened doors. It softened suspicion. People who mistrusted armed men still brought their sick to us. But there were also days I felt the shadow of that reputation. Days I sensed the West would rather hear stories of daring charges than of quiet labor beside a bed. Once in a market street, I crossed paths with a Templar. He didn't insult me. He wasn't cruel. He simply looked at the black mantle on my shoulders and spoke like a man stating a fact. He said, "You save them so they can live. We keep the road so they can arrive." I looked at him for a moment, then answered just as calmly, "Without the road, our beds mean nothing. But without the bed, your road only leads to death." For a heartbeat, he seemed ready to argue. Then his face shifted, not into agreement exactly, but into recognition. He nodded once and moved on. That exchange stayed with me because it carried the truth we all avoided. The Crusader presence in the Holy Land was held together by two kinds of work, protection and care. One without the other would collapse. Back inside our quarter, I returned to what I knew best, the infirmary. There are places in the world where you can pretend history is made by kings and battles alone. In the infirmary, you cannot pretend. History is made by breath, by fever, by clean water that arrives in time, by a wound that closes instead of spreading rot, by a child who survives the night. Our medical work in Acre was not sentimental. It was practical, relentless, and often heartbreaking. Summer heat brought stomach sickness. Crowded streets brought infection. New faces arrived every day. Sailors, pilgrims, merchants, laborers, some with injuries, some with diseases that seemed to pass from body to body like smoke in a closed room. And we treated them. Not only Christians. I remember a day when a woman who was not of our faith was brought to the entrance, supported by relatives who looked afraid. A few people outside hesitated, whispering the old suspicion. Who is she? Does she belong here? I stepped forward and said what Gerard had taught me long ago. In here, illness doesn't ask which prayer you speak. We brought her inside. We gave her water. We watched her breathing. We kept her clean. We did what we could. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was simply our rule made visible. And yet, as we cared for the sick, I began increasingly aware of the other side of our strength, the machinery of money and movement that kept our care possible. In Acre, it was impossible to separate mercy from logistics. A hospital needs grain. Grain needs ships. Ships need ports. Ports need security. Money needs trust. And trust, in a world like ours, was built on stories. So every time a ship docked, every time a barrel of flour rolled into storage, every time a letter arrived sealed with wax from some distant priory in Europe, I felt the invisible network that sustained us. The West did not see the daily reality here. They saw what we told them and what they wanted to believe. That realization troubled me at first. It felt like unclean, like mixing prayer with coin. But then, I watched the feverish child drink broth and stop trembling, and I understood. Coin is not holy, but what you do with it can be. A system can become a form of compassion, if it is built to serve. Still, Acre carried an atmosphere that I could not name at first, a pressure behind the noise. Even during the busiest days, I sometimes felt the city was balancing on something unstable, like a great ship overloaded, taking water slowly, still sailing, but with a deep creak in its bones. One night, after a long day in the infirmary, I climbed to an upper walkway and looked out over the roofs towards the harbor. Lanterns shimmered on the water. Masts stood like a forest of dark spears. The sea wind was steady, and for a moment the city seemed peaceful. But the peace felt thin. I went to sleep with that feeling still in my chest, and I dreamed something I did not understand until much later. In the dream, the city was silent, not peaceful, silent in the way a room becomes silent after everyone has left. I walked through corridors I recognized, but the air smelled of damp earth instead of incense and boiled water. I looked down, and where there should have been stone floors, there were layers, soil, silt, rubble, like time itself had poured into the building and filled it. Above me, the vaults remained, but they felt like bones. I heard voices, not in any language I knew, and then, as if the dream wanted to be understood, a phrase formed with sudden clarity inside my mind. Latin, simple and firm. Non perit, not lost, not gone. I woke up with my heart racing, my throat dry, and the sea wind still whispering through the cracks of the compound. The next day, Acre was loud again. Carts rolled, merchants shouted, brothers prayed, patients coughed. Life continued. And yet, the dream left a mark in me, like a bruise you can't explain. It reminded me that even the strongest stone can be buried. Even the loudest city can fall silent. Even the most disciplined order can be tested beyond what it expected. And if that day ever came, if the ground beneath us shifted again the way it had at Belvoir, then what would matter most would not be the height of our walls. It would be...
In Acre, I learned that every great city has more than one face. There's the face you see in daylight, the markets, the awnings, the shouting merchants, the flags of distant cities snapping in the sea wind. And then there's the face underneath, the parts built for silence, the parts built for survival, the parts that don't want witnesses. People above ground like to tell stories about Acre as if it were eternal. Stone walls, proud towers, a harbor full of masts like a forest of spears. But those of us who lived there knew the truth. Acre was a living creature. It breathed through its streets, it fed through its docks, and it carried its secrets below its feet. I first found the tunnels by accident, though in a place like Acre, nothing important is ever truly an accident. A storm rolled in one night so fast it felt like someone had slammed a door on the sea. The wind turned sharp, the rain came sideways, waves hit the quays hard enough to make the mooring ropes sing and groan. Lanterns swayed on their hooks like they were trying to escape the dark. And then a ship arrived late, a cargo ship from the west. Grain, salted goods, cloth, medicine, the kind of shipment that kept our quarter breathing. But the city was unsettled, and when weather turns foul, order turns thin.
The harbor becomes a place where a man can vanish behind a stack of barrels, and no one will know whether the sea took him or another man did. The order came quickly. Move the supplies into safety, now, no delay. I was called because I knew how to count, how to check seals, how to recognize what belonged to the hospital and what belonged to the city's endless hunger. I expected the usual route, up from the quay, through crowded streets, into guarded gates, past watchful eyes. Instead, a sergeant met me at the edge of a warehouse row and said, low and firm, "Follow, don't ask." He led me to a narrow doorway, half hidden behind stacked crates and tarps. No sign, no fanfare, just stone and shadow. A guard lifted an iron latch, and the smell that came out was not sea air or fish or spice. It was damp earth. We went down steps worn smooth by feet and time. Torchlight flickered on wet stone. The sound of the storm above faded into a muffled throb, as if the sea had been wrapped in cloth. And then the tunnel opened up. Not a crawl space, not a secret chamber, an actual passage, wide enough for carts, for pack animals, for steady traffic. The floor was uneven stone, marked with grooves where wheels had rolled for years. The walls were scarred with scratches and polished in places where hands had brushed past again and again. I stopped without meaning to. In the torchlight, it looked like the inside of a vein, an artery running beneath the city, carrying what the city needed to survive. The sergeant glanced back at me, impatient. "Move." So we moved. Porters formed a line, passing crates hand to hand. A small cart rolled forward with the weight of barrels, its wheels jolting over stones, then steadying as the men found the rhythm. A mule came next, harness creaking, eyes reflecting torchlight like a creature from another world. Except it wasn't another world, it was simply Acre's second lair. Down there you could hear different sounds. Not the shouting of merchants, not the clang of busy streets. You heard rope against wood, wheel against stone, breath, footsteps. You heard the quiet labor that keeps an empire from starving. Later, people would spin myths about tunnels, whispered rituals, forbidden meetings, hidden treasures. I understand why. Human minds prefer drama. But standing there that night, the truth was more fascinating than any rumor. The tunnel was practical power, a private route, a protected artery, a way to move goods, people, even horses away from crowds and away from the eyes of rivals. In Acre, visibility was vulnerability. So those who could afford secrecy built it in stone. As we walked, I noticed how the torchlight revealed small details, drainage channels carved along the edges, places where water ran steadily even in dry seasons, iron rings fixed into the wall for ropes or gates. This wasn't improvised, this was planned, engineered, maintained. And for the first time, I understood something about wealth that no sermon had ever taught me. Wealth isn't only gold. Wealth is control over movement. Control over movement meant control over time, and time in a war like ours was everything. We reached the junction where the passage split. A guide pointed down one route with a quick gesture. The cart team pivoted with care, turning the wheels in a tight space without crashing into the wall. Even in urgency, nothing was reckless. If you broke a cart axle down there, you didn't just lose cargo, you lost the advantage of the tunnel itself. As the line continued, I found myself reaching out and placing my palm against a stone. It was cold, damp, worn, smooth, where countless hands had pressed before mine. For a moment, I imagined all the nights like this one. Storms above, war rumors in the streets, supplies moving silently through the undercity while the world argued about glory. I imagined the West, far away, picturing Acre as a shining Crusader jewel, never seeing the damp corridors that made that jewel possible. And I wondered if this city ever fell, what would happen to this place beneath it? Would the tunnels become a tomb? Would they be sealed forever? Or would they survive the way bones survive, buried, unseen, but stubbornly present? We finished the transfer near one of the secure points, stacked barrels, rope-tight bundles, guards with steady eyes. There was no celebration. No one spoke of heroism. The work ended the way it began, quietly. On the way back, the storm's pulse above seemed more distant, as if the city had decided to keep its panic on the surface and protect its underground breathing. When we finally climbed the steps again, the wind hit me like a slap. Rain cooled my face. The harbor lights shivered on black water. Men ran with hoods up, hauling the last goods under awnings. On the quay, the world was chaos again. Wet, loud, dangerous. And that contrast stayed with me. Above ground, Acre was a storm of voices. Below ground, it was a system. Back in our quarter, I walked through the courtyard where the stones shone with damp. I could hear the chapel chants, steady, unbroken. I felt the weight of the night's labor settling into my arms and shoulders. Then I did something small, something childish maybe. I went into the chapel and lit a candle. The flame trembled for a heartbeat, then steadied. Its light was thin against the darkness, but it was enough to push back a small circle of shadow. I sat there and watched it, because I needed to believe that our order wasn't only a machine of supply and survival. I needed to believe the vow still meant something, that below the systems and logistics and guarded routes, the heart of what we were doing remained the same, to keep people alive enough to reach mercy. And yet, even as I prayed, I could not escape the thought the tunnels had planted in me. A city like Acre looked permanent. It was built of stone, defended by walls, fed by the sea. But permanence is a feeling, not a guarantee. The tunnels proved that the people of Acre understood that truth. They built for the day when streets were unsafe. They built for the day when moving openly would mean losing everything. They built for the day when escape might be the only strategy. I didn't want to say it aloud, but I felt it. The city was preparing for its own worst day, even if no one admitted it in public. Later that night, when I lay down, I could still feel the cold stone under my palm, and I could still hear the cartwheels rolling in the darkness beneath the city. It sounded like a heartbeat you only notice when it stops. And I asked myself a question that frightened me more than any storm. If Acre ever falls, what survives? The walls? Perhaps for a while. The banners? Only until someone tears them down. But the vow, our vow, would have to survive without any of that. Because we had not been founded to own a city. We had been founded to serve whoever arrived broken at the door. So I held on to that thought as tightly as a man holds on to a railing in rough seas. Acre could be loud. Acre could be wealthy. Acre could be magnificent. But underneath it all, in its hidden veins of stone, it confessed the truth the sea already knew. Everything can be taken, except what you choose to carry forward.
If you really want to understand who we were in Acre, what the Hospitallers truly protected, don't start with the walls, or the banners, or the men in armor. Start with the place nobody puts into songs. Start with the latrine. It sounds crude, I know, but in a city packed tight against the sea, where merchants, pilgrims, sailors, and soldiers pressed shoulder to shoulder, sanitation wasn't a minor detail. It was a line between a functioning stronghold and a slow collapse. You could lose a gate to a siege engine, yes, but you could also lose an entire quarter to fever if you let filth and water mingle. The first time I walked into the great latrine hall beneath our compound, it struck me like a cathedral built for necessity. Vaulted stone above, long benches of carved masonry, openings aligned with a grim precision. The floor sloped in a deliberate way, guiding waste and wash water toward channels beneath. Even without knowing the science of germs, the builders understood something important. If you don't move the filth away, it will move into you. There was a coldness down there that clung to the skin, damp stone, a faint mineral smell, and the echo of footsteps that made a single man sound like three. I watched workers check the channels, scrape residue, pour rinse water, keep the system alive. Their labor was quiet and thankless, yet it held the city together more reliably than any proud speech. Above that hall, our quarter was all movement, prayer, duty, trade, arrivals from the harbor. Below it, the city's hidden truth ran through stone pipes and reservoirs. Human life produces waste, and if you ignore it, the city punishes you. That was Acre, a place where the sacred and the practical were stitched together with no room left between them. In the infirmary, we fought a different kind of enemy, one that didn't carry banners or make demands. Disease came like a shadow that didn't need permission. In summer, the heat turned the air thick, and the crowded streets became a furnace. People arrived at our doors dizzy, weak, thirsty. Some collapsed before they could even speak. Their lips cracked, their skin burned, their eyes sank as if they were trying to retreat from the world. We did what we could with what we had. We boiled water whenever we could spare fuel. We insisted on washing hands and rinsing bowls. We changed lemons until our fingers split from soap and rough cloth. We made simple rehydrating drinks, water with a pinch of salt, sometimes mixed with whatever clean broth we could manage. It wasn't miracle work, it was careful work, and careful work is what kept people alive. There were days I felt more like a steward of water than a servant of God. And then I reminded myself, in Acre, water was mercy. I can still see the steam rising from the cauldron in our yard, white and constant, like breath in cold air. I would stir it with a wooden paddle, watching the surface tremble and settle, then carry basins into the ward. Sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is keep boiling water while the world outside argues about glory. One afternoon, a traveler was brought in, barely able to stand. We lowered him onto a bench slowly, the way you lower a child into sleep. Careful, steady, without sudden movement. His hands shook as I offered him a cup. He drank too fast at first, and I had to guide him, coax him into slower sips. When you've been deprived, you don't understand moderation. Your body thinks it must seize everything now. He survived that day. Others did not. And then there were the things that frightened people more than fever, because they felt like curses. Once as I cleaned a corner of the ward, I saw it, a pale, ribbon-like thing in a bowl. Not blood, not cloth, something else. The patient who produced it stared as if he'd seen a demon crawl out of his own body. He began to panic, whispering prayers like they were shields. I called an older healer, one of the few men in Acre who had seen enough of the world to stay calm in the face of the grotesque. He looked, nodded once, and said in a voice that carried no fear, "Not a curse. A parasite. It lives off us." Then he added something I never forgot. "Some enemies do not carry flags." It was a simple sentence, but it changed the way I thought. It reminded me that our order existed not only to protect roads and walls. We existed to protect people from the invisible things that end them quietly. Bad water, poor hygiene, food prepared in haste, bodies packed too closely together. We learned that some sickness spread when hands were careless, when water was contaminated, when food wasn't cooked enough, when waste wasn't managed. We didn't know the modern words for it, but we knew the pattern. And once you know the pattern, you can fight it, slowly, imperfectly, but with discipline. Still, fear lived in the city. At night, Acre changed its face. The markets closed, lanterns replaced sunlight, the harbor wind carried mist into the streets. In the taverns near the quay, men drank to forget the day and to numb their thoughts about the future. One night, after a long shift, I passed a tavern doorway and heard a voice I didn't recognize, old, rough, steady as a tide-worn rock. I stepped inside just long enough to listen. A sailor sat hunched over a cup, his hands scarred, his skin cracked with salt. He spoke as if he weren't trying to impress anyone, only trying to warn them. "The sea is saltier tonight," he muttered. "Not because of salt, because there's more grief." Some men laughed, others glanced away, uncomfortable. I didn't laugh. I walked out into the harbor fog with that sentence lodged in my chest like a stone. In Acre, even drunken words could feel like prophecy. That night, I returned to our chapel and knelt. I didn't ask for victory or triumph. I asked for steadiness, for the strength to keep doing the work that needed doing, even if the city's fate was already bending towards something darker. Then I slept, or tried to, because that's when the dream came back, the one that had been circling the edges of my mind ever since I first began to feel the ground shifting beneath Acre's confidence. In the dream, the city was silent, not peaceful, silent like a room after the last candle goes out. I walked through streets I knew, but the air was heavy with fog, and the banners hung still as if the wind had died. I stepped into our halls and found that the floors were no longer clear. Earth had poured into the rooms like water. Fine silt lay against the walls, forming soft ridges where stone should have been bare. I moved deeper and I saw the vaults, still standing, but empty, as if the building had become a skeleton. Then I heard another sound, a scrape, a soft thud, a slow rhythm of labor. Figures moved through the buried halls. Not demons, not spirits. People. Cloaked silhouettes holding oil lamps and simple iron tools. They worked carefully, patiently, like monks unearthing scripture. They lifted soil in baskets, they brushed stone. They followed the layers as if time itself had become visible, stacked one season over another. One of them wiped dust from a stone surface, and a carved white cross appeared beneath the grime, clean and unmistakable. My heart tightened. Even in the dream, I felt the ache of recognition. The figures didn't speak to me, but one of them paused, lamp held high, and for a heartbeat I had the impossible feeling that they were looking directly at me, across centuries, across collapse, across the burial of an entire city. Then, as if the dream wanted to give me a final answer, a phrase formed in my mind with perfect clarity, Latin again, simple and final. Non-period. Not lost. Not gone. I woke with my breath caught, the air cold against my face. The chapel bell had not rung. No one had called for me, yet my body reacted as if summoned. I lay still for a moment, listening to the city's night sounds, distant waves, faint footsteps, the soft creak of timber somewhere in the compound, and I realized what the dream was trying to teach me. Acre might fall, buildings might be buried, halls might vanish under layers of ruin and earth, but the work, what we were, didn't have to vanish with stone, because our order wasn't truly made of castles. It was made of habits, of discipline, of a hand offered to the sick, of water boiled again and again, of a refusal to ask the suffering what faith they carried before we carried them inside. Before dawn, I rose and went to the chapel. The candles were low, their flames small but stubborn. I lit a fresh one from an older flame. The new wick caught and steadied, a quiet little victory against darkness. Then I walked to the infirmary. The day began the way it always did. Attendants lifting basins, novices carrying linens, someone coughing behind a screen, a bowl being set down with care. Outside, Acre was already waking,
its endless noise returning as if nothing could ever silence it. I didn't know then how close the city was to its last days. I only knew what I could control. The next hour, the next patient, the next clean cloth, the next cup of water. And as I tied a bandage with practice fingers, I held one thought close, like a secret vow inside the vow. If the world insists on bearing what we build, then we will build again. If the city insists on forgetting, then we will remember through action. Because when the bell rings, and it always rings somewhere, our answer has never in stone or steel. Our answer is to show up.
By the spring of 1291, Acre no longer felt like a city. It felt like a heartbeat you could hear too clearly. Fast, anxious, and tracked inside stone. From the walls at dawn, I watched the horizon change. At first, it was only dust, a low smear over the fields beyond the ditch. Then shapes formed inside it. Tents, lines of men, standards rising and multiplying like dark reeds in a flooded plain. The Mamluk host did not arrive with drama. It arrived with certainty, methodical, measured, as if it had already decided how the story would end. Behind me, Acre was waking the way it always did. Carts creaked, harbor bells marked the hours, merchants shouted as if noise alone could keep fear away. Flags, royal, Italian, and the crosses of the orders snapped in the sea wind, bright against the sky. But even the colors looked strained, like cloth pulled too tight. Inside our hospitaller quarter, the routine hardened into purpose. We didn't waste time on speeches. We sorted supplies. We moved barrels into deeper stores. We checked the wells and cisterns. We boiled water until the air smelled permanently of steam and herbs. And we reinforced everything. Doors, gates, wall walks, weak sections of masonry. A city under siege doesn't live on courage. It lives on planning. In the refectory, the vaulted ceiling swallowed every sound, until even a whisper felt like it might echo too far. A sealed message was read aloud, short, spare, with the weight of an anvil. The camp was large. The engines were coming. The assault would be patient. When the reading ended, no one argued. A brother across from me crossed himself and stood. Others followed. Bowls were cleared. The room emptied. The day's work resumed as if we were pieces inside a machine that had finally found its true function. I went to the armory, not because I wanted to, but because reality demanded it. The mail shirt was colder than I expected, even in the heat of Acre. As I pulled it over the padded cloth beneath, its weight settled across my shoulders like a sentence. I tightened straps slowly, carefully, feeling how the metal changed the way my body moved. I was still the same man who carried water and wrapped wounds, but now the city required that I also carry readiness. Outside, the enemy's preparations became visible. On the far side of the ditch, frames rose, timbers lashed, ropes tensioned, arms tested. Trebuchets. I had seen them before, but never in such numbers, never with such calm confidence behind them. The first day the bombardment began, the sky seemed to harden. The trebuchet arm swung up in a long arc, and for a moment it looked almost slow, like a ritual. Then the counterweight dropped, the sling snapped, and the stone sailed toward us. You could follow it with your eyes if you were foolish enough to try. Then came the impact, a heavy blow against masonry, a bloom of dust, a shower of chips that glittered briefly in sunlight before falling like rain. Men on the wall ducked and braced. No panic, just instinct and training. Shields rose, helmets lowered, feet adjusted on stone slick with dust. It wasn't glorious, it was survival measured one heartbeat at a time. Down in the streets, the city's rhythm changed. People began moving with bundles, quietly at first, then faster. Families carried what they could. Priests guided small groups toward safer lanes. A mother pulled her child close, eyes wide, as if the child might be taken by air itself. I found myself stepping into the flow, directing people away from exposed areas, toward inner courtyards and stone corridors that might hold if the outer walls did not. When the first wounded were brought to us, the infirmary became what it had always been, only louder, fuller, heavier. We carried men on stretchers through narrow passages. We laid them down, checked breathing, cleaned grit from eyes, tied bandages with hands that knew the work too well. Smoke seeped into the ward, not as a cloud of drama, but as a constant thin veil that made every candle burn with a trembling halo. In moments between patients, I returned to the hearth to boil water again. The ladle felt heavier each hour. Cloth steamed as we lifted it with tongs. Knots were tied and retied. Cups were filled, lips were moistened. This, I kept telling myself, is what we are. Even now, especially now. And still, the wall demanded attention. Sometimes the bombardment paused, and that silence was almost worse than noise. In the pause, repair crews moved like ants across damaged stone. Buckets passed hand to hand. Timber braces were hoisted with pulleys. Stones were lifted by 2 men at a time, set carefully, wedged and packed. Every repair felt like trying to stitch skin while a blade hovers inches away. Then the assault came closer. Ladders appeared through dust haze. A line of movement at the base of the wall, then sudden vertical shapes pressing upward. Defenders leaned over using long poles to push the ladders away. Wood flexed under strain. Arms shook from effort. A ladder slipped, then dropped out of view. No cheering, just the next ladder, the next shove, the next bath. On the parapet, smoke and dust made the sun look sickly. I saw men brace shield to shield at a narrow point, bodies pressed tight, feet sliding on grit. The motion was not wild, it was compressive. Pressure and counter-pressure, each side trying to gain a handspan without losing balance. Armor made every movement slower, heavier, more honest.
Nothing floated, nothing looked heroic up close. It looked difficult. That night in the chapel, the air was thick with incense and a different kind of smoke drifting in from the city. Candle flames trembled as if the stone vault itself was breathing. We knelt and rose, not for spectacle, but because kneeling was the one posture the siege could not take from us. I bowed my head and listened, not for words, but for steadiness. Somewhere beyond the walls, the siege engines creaked and reset. Somewhere inside the city, a child cried and then went quiet. Somewhere in the harbor, ropes groaned as ships rocked against the quays. And then the realization I had tried to avoid settled into my bones. Acre was being squeezed from both sides, from land by the siege and from sea by fear. Fear that the sea would not be enough to save everyone. When the harbor began to fill with crowds, I went there myself. It was late afternoon, haze thick, flags snapping above a tide of people. Sailors shouted orders. Gangplanks shifted under weight, barrels rolled. A capstan turned, men leaning into it with shoulders and backs like they were pushing against fate itself. Families pressed close together, clutching bundles that looked too small to matter and too precious to drop. I stood at the edge of the quay, hand on cold stone, and felt something split in me. Part of me wanted to stay, to remain inside the city until the last possible moment, because leaving felt like betrayal. Another part of me, older, harder, more honest, knew that an order is more than a place. If we died here entirely, our vow would die with us. And then who would tend the next pilgrim on the next road in whatever land came after this? That's when the tunnels returned to my mind, not as a curiosity, but as a lifeline. We began moving our most essential supplies quietly. Medical bundles, seal-marked chests, documents, portable reliquaries, anything that could preserve the order's continuity. In the underground corridors, torchlight shook on damp stone. Carts rolled carefully. Hands passed rope-tied bundles with steady rhythm. Above us, the city shook. Below, we moved like a heartbeat, determined not to stop. When the decision came to guide small groups through those passages toward the harbor, we did it without panic. One group at a time, controlled steps, quiet voices, a hand on a shoulder guiding someone down a stair in the dark. The tunnel door opened near the quay and the sea air rushed in, cold, salty, alive. On the quay, the chaos felt louder after the silence underground. But even then, we kept the line moving as best we could. A rope ladder swung. I steadied it with one hand, feeling the ship's motion through the rope like a living thing. An elderly pilgrim trembled on the plank. I held their arm and adjusted our balance together as the board shifted beneath our feet. Then I stepped onto the deck. The ship rolled gently, and my body compensated without thinking. Knees flexing, shoulders adjusting, weight shifting into my heels. Around me, faces were pale in lantern light. Some people stared back toward the city as if their eyes could hold it in place. I moved below to help secure barrels and chests so they wouldn't shift in the hold. In rough water, a loose barrel becomes a weapon. So we wedged them tight, tied them down, did the small practical work that keeps a ship from turning into a disaster. When I returned to the deck, the ship was already pulling away. Acre rose behind us in torchlight and smoke. Towers cut into the night sky. The glow of fires and the haze of dust made the city look like it was dissolving into the air. I gripped the rail until my knuckles went white, then forced myself to loosen my hand. Holding tighter would not change a thing. The water between us and the quay widened, slowly at first, then with a steady inevitability. A wake formed behind the ship, spreading into ripples that caught lantern light and shattered it into pieces. I did not speak a farewell. The words felt too small. I simply watched. And in that watching I understood what exile truly meant. Not just leaving land, leaving a chapter, leaving the sound of familiar streets, leaving the stone halls where we had prayed and fed the sick and counted barrels and believed, despite everything, that Acre might hold. At dawn, the coastline was only a smudge behind sea haze. The convoy moved forward, sails filling gradually as the wind steadied. Men trimmed lines with practiced hands. The ship creaked and settled into its pace. I stood at the bow and looked ahead. The Holy Land was behind us, not in our hearts, never in our hearts, but behind our feet. And the future was not a city anymore. It was water, islands, new walls, and a vow that had to learn how to travel. Somewhere far ahead, beyond the first line of islands, roads waited. An island strong enough to become a new anchor, a place where our order could stand again and continue what began in Jerusalem with a simple bell calling for help. I pulled my cloak tighter against the wind, and I made a promise without ceremony. We may lose the stones, we may lose the streets, but we will not lose the work.
When Acre fell behind us, the sea became our only road, and for a while it felt like the sea was judging us. The wind had changed since the Holy Land. It was cooler, sharper, full of salt and distance. On deck, our cloaks dried stiff with spray, and our thoughts moved the way the waves moved, forward, whether we were ready or not. We were no longer defending a city. We were defending the idea that our order still had a purpose. That's what made Rhodes different from every stop that came before it. Rhodes wasn't a memory. It was a decision. The first time I saw the island clearly, it rose out of the Aegean haze like a fortress that nature had already half-built. Rocky headlands, bright water, and walls that caught the sun in pale streaks. The harbor towers stood watch over a narrow mouth of sea, and behind them the city climbed, layered and old, shaped by the Eastern Roman world we'd once called distant. I remember the feeling in my stomach as we approached, not triumph, not even relief, something closer to a sober calculation. If we were going to survive after the loss of the Holy Land, we needed more than houses scattered across Europe. We needed independence, an island that could feed us, shelter us, and give us a base that no king could seize overnight with a decree. In the years after we arrived in the Aegean, people would argue about what we did next. Some would call it necessity, some would call it ambition, some would call it betrayal, because Rhodes belonged to Christians too, Byzantine Christians, not Latins like us. But history isn't lived in clean categories. It's lived in the pressure between choices. We told ourselves a story we could bear, that we needed roads to continue defending Christendom against Muslim power at sea. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. The full truth was simpler and harder. Without an independent base, we could be destroyed the way others had been destroyed, by politics, by envy, by a ruler deciding our usefulness had expired. Roads offered a kind of security you can't buy with faith alone. So we moved toward it with a purpose that felt like fate. The first nights were not glorious. They were tense, quiet, full of careful movement. Scouts went ashore under dusk. Men moved through olive groves with shields close to the body and torches hidden. We watched gatehouses from shadow, counted patrols, measured distances. And I learned again what I had learned in Acre. Victory is built from logistics long before anyone speaks about courage. When the moment came, it came in fog and low light, the kind of hour when stone looks like water and footsteps sound too loud. Ladders rose against an outer wall, hands gripped wet rungs, breath clouded in the cold dawn. The wall-top struggle was close and heavy, the kind of press where armor matters and every shove has a cost. Nothing about it resembled a legend. It was men and stone and effort and the knowledge that if you slipped, the world would not pause to catch you. By sunrise, we had a foothold. And once a foothold exists, the world changes quickly. A tower taken becomes a statement. A banner raised becomes an announcement. I watched a white cross climb a captured height, rope sliding through gloved hands, cloth catching wind. As it unfurled, the city below seemed to hold its breath. Not everyone greeted us with fear. Not everyone greeted us with welcome. Most people simply watched. Greek civilians in doorways and alleys, faces guarded, uncertain what this new rule would mean. In their eyes, I saw what I had seen in the eyes of refugees in Acre, the instinct to survive first and judge later. That was when I understood something about conquest that no military training ever teaches. Taking a place is only the beginning. Keeping it without poisoning it is the real test. In the days that followed, negotiations began. Local leaders demanded assurances. Our commanders offered them. Voices stayed low. Gestures stayed measured. In the great halls, under arches that belonged to another tradition of Christianity, men spoke carefully, because careless words can create enemies faster than any army. I walked through the streets and tried to carry myself differently than I had in the Holy Land, not as a man passing through, not as a man clinging to a lost cause, but as a brother of an order that had to become a government, whether we liked it or not. And I returned again and again to the work that kept my heart from hardening, the infirmary. In Rhodes, we rebuilt our medical space almost immediately. Linen screens, basins, herbs, clean water, rules. The same quiet discipline as in Jerusalem, as in Acre, because sickness does not wait for politics to settle. Sailors arrived with infected cuts, laborers collapsed from heat, children brought fevers that spread in cramped neighborhoods. Our doors opened the same way they always had. Wash, boil, bind, feed, watch, pray. That routine kept me anchored while the order's purpose expanded around me like new walls. And walls, on Rhodes, walls became our language. We didn't just occupy existing fortifications. We improved them, strengthened them, reshaped them for the threats we knew would come. Stonecutters worked under the Aegean sun, scaffolds rose, pulleys creaked as blocks were hoisted into place. Dust hung in the air like a second weather, coating everything, hair, eyebrows, the creases of a mantle. I often stood near the works and watched how carefully men moved when lifting stone. 2 men adjusting a block by inches, not because inches were dramatic, but because inches mattered. A block set poorly becomes a weakness becomes a breach, and a breach becomes a story someone else gets to write. We built granaries and sealed storehouses. We guarded them like altars. We checked barrels for rot, wax seals for tampering, grain for pests. We built cisterns and protected the water supply with an almost religious seriousness, because siege doesn't begin when an enemy arrives. Siege begins when you start counting water. We also built something we had never truly possessed in the Holy Land, a sea arm. Rhodes taught us the meaning of naval power. In the shipyard, timber frames rose like ribs, tar pots simmered, rope coils lay in neat stacks. Shipwrights hammered oakum into seams with steady rhythm, then sealed it with tar until the wood looked almost black in the sun. When a new galley slid into the water on rollers, the hull took the sea with a deep, satisfying settle, like a creature returning to its element. And when those galleys began training, oars dipping in unison, rowers' backs and shoulders moving like a single organism, I felt something I hadn't felt since the early days of the hospital in Jerusalem. Momentum. Not reckless momentum, purposeful momentum. We patrolled the Aegean routes, we watched for raiders, we escorted convoys. We learned that controlling the sea lanes meant controlling the flow of food, coin, information, and reinforcements. It meant we could keep our own lungs filled even when enemies tried to choke us. At times, the work was tense, a suspicious sail on the horizon, a small craft keeping distance, a change in wind that forced decisions. But even then, our movements were measured. You don't survive at sea by pretending you're invincible. You survive by respecting physics, weather, and the limits of wood and rope. Slowly, Rhodes became what Acre could never be, an island that belonged to us.
Not because we were loved, not because we were always just, but because we built a system strong enough to hold. We held councils in vaulted halls and pressed wax seals onto letters that traveled west. We collected revenues, we granted permissions, we trained men, we punished theft, we negotiated with local powers, we prayed. Because a military order that forgets prayer becomes just another armed faction, and the world already had too many of those. At night, I often went up to the walls. The harbor lanterns shimmered on dark water. The wind carried sea mist into the stone joints. Torches flared and guttered. Sentries walked steady paths, their pace unbroken. And I would stand there and ask myself if this was what Gerard meant long ago, when he spoke about a living fence. A fence that now spanned an island. A fence that had to defend not only roads, but the very idea that our vows still had meaning. Sometimes in the quietest hours, I would touch a carved cross in the stone, freshly chiseled, dust still lingering in the grooves. It reminded me that even after exile, we could still mark the world with what we believed. And yet, I never fully shook the memory of Acre. I knew what walls could do, and I knew what walls could not guarantee. So when roads felt secure, when the shipyard rang with hammers and the granaries filled and the harbor chain lifted and lowered like a practiced heartbeat, I didn't allow myself to mistake stability for permanence. Roads was an answer to disaster, but it was not the end of our trials. It was simply the next chapter, a new anchor for an old vow. And as the sun rose over the Aegean and the white cross snapped in the wind above the towers, I understood the shape of our future more clearly than ever. If we could no longer hold Jerusalem, we would hold something else, an outpost, a harbor, a road at sea, and we would keep doing what we had promised to do. Care for the sick, protect the vulnerable, remain standing long enough to matter.
In the year 1480, Rhodes woke each morning as if the sea itself were holding its breath. From the wall walk at sunrise, I could see our banners, white crosses on dark cloth, snapping hard in the Aegean wind. The stone beneath my boots was familiar, worn smooth by decades of patrol, prayer, and preparation. I was older then. My joints reminded me of every campaign and every winter night spent on cold masonry. But age didn't soften the responsibility. If anything, it sharpened it. Because on Rhodes, the horizon was never empty for long. The first warning came from the watchtower above the harbor mouth. A sentry called down, not with panic, but with the controlled urgency of a man who knows the difference between rumor and reality. I climbed until the city fell away behind me, and the sea opened like a sheet of hammered metal, bright and deceptive. At first, I saw nothing but haze. Then shapes appeared, dark strokes on the edge of the world. One sail, then another, then so many that the line of the horizon seemed crowded. An Ottoman fleet, vast enough to turn the sea into a road of war, closing toward Rhodes with steady purpose. No one cheered. No one shouted speeches. We had learned by then that courage without discipline is only noise. In the harbor below, our men worked with quiet precision. The great chain across the entrance was tightened and checked again. Mooring ropes were pulled until they hummed with tension. Galleys were secured behind stone and iron. Dock workers moved like they had become part of the fortress itself, rolling barrels, stocking grain, hauling timber, all in measured rhythm. Inside the Grand Master's courtyard, the order assembled. Knights in late medieval armor, mail and plate mixed with leather strops, stood in ranks beneath the archways. Heat shimmered above stone, sweat darkened cloth. I watched men adjust buckles and tighten belts, not like heroes posing for a painter, but like laborers preparing for a long shift of danger. Even the powder stores were handled like a sacred place. Lanterns were kept guarded, kegs were carried slowly, 2 men to a load, steps careful and deliberate. One careless stumble could do more damage than any enemy battery. By dusk, the Ottoman camp began to form on the shore. Tents multiplied, standards rose. Earthworks appeared as if the ground itself had decided to become hostile. Engineers built gabions and trenches with a patience that was almost frightening. There was nothing emotional in their movement. It was method, repeated, the same method that had broken other strongholds across the Mediterranean. That night on the walls, torches guttered in a wet sea wind. Fog rolled in and out like a living thing, swallowing parts of the city and returning them again. Our sentries continued their steady pace. The rhythm mattered. In a siege, routine is not comfort, it is control. I went to the chapel before dawn. The interior smelled of wax and incense. The stone arches held the warmth of candlelight as if they were protecting it. Brothers knelt close together. In that glow, the white cross was not a banner. It was a reminder of what we were supposed to remain, no matter what pressure came against our walls. When the first great exchange of artillery began, the entire city felt it. The sound was not like thunder far away. It was like stone itself being struck and forced to answer. Our gunners worked in teams, ramming charges, setting fuses, stepping back in practiced sequence. When a cannon fired, the recoil shoved its carriage backward with a brutal honesty. Wheels rolled across the platform, chocks caught, men braced and pushed the gun back into position.
Smoke expanded, then tore apart in the sea wind. Soot clung to faces. In the daylight haze, the sun looked pale and sickly, like it had been rubbed with ash. The Ottoman batteries returned fire from their earthworks. Their match courts glowed briefly, then vanished in bursts of smoke. Impacts struck our outer walls, sending stone chips and dust into the air. Men ducked behind crenellations and rose again without drama. Every motion had to be efficient. Every wasted second invited injury. Inside the city, civilians moved quickly through the streets carrying bundles, food, cloth, tools, a few precious objects that gave them the courage to keep walking. I guided small groups into sheltered corridors and deeper stone halls. I did it the same way I had done in Acre years before. Calm hands, firm direction, no words that might turn fear into panic. And then the infirmary filled. We set up linen screens and arranged beds in rows. Bowls of water, strips of clean cloth, herbs, and lamps became the center of our world. I washed my hands again and again until my skin felt raw. I tied bandages with controlled tension, knots firm enough to hold, gentle enough not to cut circulation. I checked pulses the way a man checks the tide, carefully, repeatedly, knowing that what changes slowly can still become dangerous. Outside, the siege deepened. Ottoman engineers dug trenches and pushed them forward like a slow tide of earth. They built covered approaches, stacked gabions, and most unsettling of all, they dug down, mining. A quiet threat, riving beneath the stone like an unseen knife. So we answered with our own tunnels. In the countermine corridors, torchlight flickered over damp stone and timber supports. Men pressed ears to walls, listening not for voices but for the faint suggestion of tool on earth. When they heard something, they signaled with a hand, a tap, a look. No wasted talk. In those underground passages, sound was a betrayal. Above ground, the Tower of St. Nicholas guarded the harbor like a clenched fist. Waves slopped its base, smoke drifted on the horizon. Ottoman boats probed the water approaches, and our gunners answered from the tower platform. When a cannon fired there, the smoke burst outward and then was ripped sideways by wind, as if the sea refused to let anything remain still. The longest nights were the ones when nothing decisive happened, because in those hours you could feel the siege trying to climb inside your mind. Campfires dotted the shore like a second city made of embers. Our torches marked the walls in return, a thin line of light insisting that Rhodes was still awake. Patrols continued, repairs continued, men spoke softly. Even laughter when it came sounded like something remembered rather than something natural. Then came the great push. Before dawn, the Ottoman lines formed behind shields. The air was thick with dust and fog. From the parapet, we saw movement advancing in measured cadence, a dark pressure rolling toward a damaged sector of wall. Ladders came forward, poles rose in our hands. There was no poetry in that moment, only effort. I remember the feel of wood under my gloves and the way my shoulders tightened as we leaned into a shove. The pole flexed slam under load. The ladder shifted. For a breathless instant it held, and then it dropped out of sight. Not triumph, just one danger removed and another appearing seconds later. At the gatehouse, men slid heavy beams into slots, bracing timber barricades inside stone corridors. If the outer line failed, we had an inner line. If that failed, we had another. Layer upper layer, built not for glory but for endurance. At one point, a massive dust cloud rose. Stone had collapsed somewhere along a stressed section. There was no clear vision, only grit in the air and light shafts cutting through haze. Men stepped back carefully over unstable rubble, arms raised to protect eyes, feet searching for solid ground. In that dust, even the white cross on my mantle disappeared under ash. I wiped it once with a gloved thumb, and the cloth brightened again, small, stubborn, defiant. Eventually the pressure broke, not our walls, but the enemy's momentum. By morning, the smoke thinned enough to see the sea clearly again. Our banner still flew. Men stood on the parapet, catching their breath, helmets in their hands, faces streaked with soot and exhaustion. No one celebrated wildly. We were too tired and too aware of how close the edge had been. Across the plain, the Ottoman camp began to withdraw. Tents came down, lines moved back. Ships prepared to take men away. Even their retreat was organized, disciplined, almost dignified in its own harsh way. That was when we learned a second truth about war. Winning on the battlefield is only half the fight. The other half is winning the story. Within days, scribes gathered in quiet chambers. Parchment-covered tables, wax seals weighted by side candles. An official account began to take shape. What had happened, what had been endured, what had been proven to the world. I watched a scribe's quill move across the page, ink catching the light, and I understood that this writing was not merely memory, it was strategy, because Europe had to believe that Rhodes still mattered. The message traveled west by ship, sealed letters, reports, and then something new for our age, printed accounts. In workshops far from the Aegean, places like Venice and other cities of inking commerce, printers set movable type with stained fingers. A hand press descended, paper took the impression, copies multiplied. Pamphlets spread through marketplaces and churches. People leaned in to read. Priests held the pages up by candlelight. Noblemen listened, then opened chests and dropped coins into them, convinced once more that the Order of St. John was still the wall between their world and something darker. Back on Rhodes, we didn't rest. Victories do not remove threats, they invite the next one. We repaired bastions, we reset guns, we inventoried supplies. We carved new crosses into replacement stones and set them carefully into battered walls. Each chisel strike felt like a vow made physical. At sunset, I walked the parapet again.
The Ottoman fleet had come again. In Rhodes, we were used to threats. We had faced them before. But this time, the scale felt different. Less like a raid, more like a conclusion that had been prepared for years. The harbor chain was tightened until it sang under tension. Galleys were secured behind stone towers. Barrels were rolled into deep stores. Water was counted. Powder was guarded like a sacred thing. Lanterns kept steady. Steps measured so that nothing accidental could add to the danger. In the Grand Master's courtyard, the order assembled beneath the arches. I watched men tighten straps and check shields, their faces set in the quiet discipline that Rhodes demanded. No speeches, no theater. By then we understood. Courage is not a mood, it's a routine. Ottoman troops landed on the shore and built their camp with the patience of craftsmen. Tents rose, standards planted, earthworks shaped, guns hauled forward on heavy frames.
The dust of their labor drifted in the sun like a second weather. That first night, torches guttered along our walls and sea fog rolled in, swallowing parts of the city and returning them again. Sentries paced steadily, boots striking stone in the same measured rhythm we had kept for generations. In a siege, that rhythm matters. It tells the mind it still has structure, even when the world tries to break it. I went to the chapel before dawn. Candles burned low, their light warm against cold stone. Incense rose in thin ribbons, mixing with the faint scent of smoke that carried in from outside. I knelt and tried to pray the way I did when I was young, simple words, clean faith. But age changes prayer. When you've seen cities fall and promises tested, you don't ask for triumph, you ask for steadiness. Then the bombardment began. The sound was not like distant thunder, it was heavier, closer, like stone itself being forced to answer. Our cannon crews worked in practice sequence, load, tamp, set, step back. When a gun fired, it pushed against the earth with brutal honesty, the carriage rolling back, men bracing and guiding it, smoke blooming outward before the wind tore it apart. The Ottoman batteries returned fire from their earthworks. Impacts struck our wall, sending dust and chips into the air. Men ducked, rose, and continued, as if the body had learned to move without asking permission from fear. Inside the city, people began to live differently. Families carried bundles through smoke haze and sunlight shafts. Doors stayed shut. Voices grew quieter. I guided small groups towards sheltered corridors and stone halls, the same way I had done in Acre long ago. A calm hand on a shoulder can do more than a shouted order. Panic spreads faster than any disease if you let it. And of course, the infirmary filled. It always does. We set linen screens and arranged beds. We boiled water until steam felt like the very breath of our order. I washed my hands again and again until my skin burned, and I tied bandages with careful tension, tight enough to hold, gentle enough not to harm. I watched eyes for shock, lips for thirst, breath for changes that meant danger. The work was never heroic, it was simply necessary. Outside, the siege tightened. Trenches crept forward like a slow tide, made of earth and patience. Then came the deeper threat, mining, a quiet pressure under the stone, a danger you couldn't see until it had already changed the ground beneath you. We answered with countermines of our own, damp corridors supported by timber, torchlight trembling on wet stone. Men pressed ears to walls, listening for faint vibrations, then signaling with a hand or a look. In those passages, sound was cautious. It could warn you or betray you. Weeks passed. The city learned a new calendar, not feast days, but the rhythm of bombardment, repair, night watch, and prayer. Every sunrise felt earned. Every night felt longer than it should. Roads had endured before, but endurance has limits, not in pride, but in supplies and bodies. A fortress can stand only as long as water holds, powder holds, food holds, and the will of exhausted men still answers the bell. At last the day came when our leaders stopped asking, "Can we hold?" and began asking, "What must survive if we cannot?" That shift is harder than any enemy to face. A truce flag was raised and the city held its breath. Envoys moved carefully between lines. Sealed documents were carried like fragile glass. In an Ottoman tent lit by lantern glow and guarded with disciplined silence, words were exchanged that no one wanted to speak, but everyone understood. The surrender of Rhodes in 1522 was not a collapse into chaos. It was a decision made to preserve what could still be preserved: the people, the order, the vow itself. On the morning of departure, the harbor looked almost peaceful. Sea mist drifted across the water, ships waited, our banners were lowered. Lines formed, knights, brothers, civilians, moving in measured steps, carrying what they could. Some held chests, some held bundles, some held nothing but a hand to guide a child. I packed my own small chest with the things that mattered most to me: linen rolls, herbs, a few simple tools, and a wooden cross worn smooth by years of touch. I closed the lid and felt the weight of it, not heavy in the hands, heavy in meaning. Before I boarded, I returned to the chapel one last time. The candles were still burning, the stone was still cold. I placed my fingertips on the floor and let myself feel it. This place where we had prayed through storms, through fear, through victory, through loss. Then I rose slowly, the way an old man rises when he does not want his body to reveal how much he is breaking inside. On the quay, the gangplank shifted underfoot as I stepped onto the ship. The sea has its own rules, and it doesn't care about grief. I steadied myself, then reached back to help another person board. Balance, wait, one step at a time. The fleet pulled away at sunrise. Roads faded behind haze, towers turning into pale shapes, then into nothing. I stood at the stern and watched until my eyes could no longer separate the island from the sky. My hand gripped the rail, then released. Holding tighter would not bring it back. Exile, I learned, is not a single moment. It's the long stretch afterwards, when the sea is all you see, and you have to decide what you still are without your walls. We reached ports in Italy, we sought allies, we waited, negotiated, endured the slow politics of survival. And then in the year 1530, a new chance arrived, the grant of Malta. Not a return to Rhodes, not a return to Jerusalem. Something new, rocky, harsh, strategic. An island that could become a home if we were willing to build again. When Malta's coastline appeared at dawn, it looked unforgiving, cliffs and bright stone under a hard sun. But I had learned not to mistake harshness for hopelessness. We landed with chests and tools, with weary men and stubborn purpose. Local fishermen watched from a distance as if trying to decide whether we were a storm or a shelter. The first thing I did was what I had always done. I found a space for an infirmary. Linen screens, basins, clean water, herbs laid out in order. A place where the sick could lie down without being questioned. I washed my hands again, and for a moment the years fell away, and I was a novice again in Jerusalem, answering a bell. Because that is what survived every collapse. Not the towers, not the banners. The answer to the bell. And as the white cross was carved into Maltese stone once more, I understood the shape of our legacy. Our order did not survive because we never lost. We survived because we kept rebuilding the same promise in whatever land history left us standing. Care for those who arrive, hold the line of mercy, and keep moving forward, one measured step at a time.